Hey, thanks for the little technical glitch there, but my pleasure to be here today. And if you had a chance actually to look at some of the work we started working on about 5-6 years ago, if you haven't, you can actually go see some of the work that I'm going to be presenting here today at MuniTree. You can actually just Google my name, Hauer and Muni, and you'll actually come to the website that also has all this information. All right. So, it takes resources to do work, and one of the aspects of doing resources certainly is money at a municipal level. And so if you're curious, how much of the total allocation is spent on urban forestry? About half a penny. So about 0.5% is what is currently spent. And how you interpret this graph, if you're within one of the population groups, that number is your comparable. At the total of all cities, this is actually at the person level. So how we did the statistics was we looked at the person as being an important part of urban forestry. So, the 0.52, on average, a person lives in a town that spends that amount of money. We'll also use this theme here as we talk about things such as Emerald Ash Borer and how does that affect budgets. So, how do we allocate all this money? Well, we got the big three. About a quarter of the total pie is tree pruning, and about a little over 60% encapsulates tree planting and tree removal. Now, this has been really consistent since the work was first started by Dr. Jim Cabasso back in the 1970s. But you can see here's the allocation of the resources for various parts. Certainly tree pruning is one of those aspects, but I do want to point out that tree pruning is not separated from all these other things we do, and you'll see the connection here today. So let's take the first thing, pruning cycles. I like to brand them as inspection cycles because it's like going to a doctor. You don't actually have medical procedures done unless they're needed. So a pruning cycle you could really think of as an inspection cycle, and there's a lot of things you could think about. Certainly pruning is one of those with a tree. Here's just a city in Illinois, Village Wilmette, that they're on about maybe a 6-year cycle here from looking at this map here where they've got the next 3 years kind of planned out. Now, how much work is done systematically? Now, you can look at urban forestry as systematic management or crisis management. Now, when Cabasso first started collecting this data, what he found was back in the 1970s, about 56% of the work was done systematically according to the respondents. By 1980, this had actually went down to 50%. By 1986, it went down to 39%. Now, if you know anything about the late 1970s and early 1980s, we had some, economic challenges. Certainly we have economic challenges in the present, but if you want to think about mortgage rates, boy, if you're around this time period, I remember my parents getting a mortgage for 14%, and they're tickled. We had farm mortgages that were in the 20% range. So our 2.5, 3.5s don't really seem too bad relative. And then in the 1990s, the data wasn't collected. What do we have in the more present? About 55%. Okay, so 55% of the work is done systematically in the United States. We can also look at this from a pruning perspective, and we think of how is work actually done? Do we prune trees or we don't? Fortunately, only about 1% of the people live in a town that the respondents said they don't prune trees. Nearly about half of the towns said they prune as needed or emergency only, which is certainly not desirable, and we'll see why here today. Or half approximately said on a regular pruning cycle. We can also look at this at a more traditional level of what is your cycle. So whether we call it inspection, like I like to brand it, or a pruning cycle as traditionally has been called, people told us that they're at about 6.6 years is their current mean pruning or inspection cycle. They desire to be at 4.8, and so we're approximately 1.8 years off of that. And as you can see here, it's pretty consistent through many of the population groups, except actually that 500,000 to 1 million group. And these are the Baltimores and the Detroits of the world where they had some real economic challenges from the Great Recession of the last decade, or actually the decade before that in the 08 time period. So just to say that these things certainly have some legacy effects. Pruning was one of these that we kind of detected. So now let's look at pests. And things certainly are not disconnected. Pruning or emerald ash borer. Now, how does emerald ash borer relate to pruning? You'll see this in a second here. Now, when we're doing this work, something came to light to me that I was looking at some states like Illinois that were spending about 3 times more than other states on average. And I dug into this deeper, and what I discovered was if you look at towns that just had emerald ash borer just discovered that year in their state, or up to the next 4 years, that really emerald ash borer had no effect on pruning budgets, let's say. But they had an effect on year 5 to 8, and then things come back to more normal. So now how does emerald ash borer then actually relate to our pruning aspect and what we spend? Well, it probably doesn't surprise you. If you have a pest and you have to spend a lot of money removing trees, your removal budget goes up. Same thing for stump removal. But we did find things such as public education or watering of trees or safety of employees or plant health care as fertilization, for example, and tree pruning all declined. And this is a lesson that was actually learned from the Dutch elm disease days, for example. In Milwaukee, they discovered that they were spending so much money on removing trees from Dutch elm disease that their pruning budgets were affected. And that has a legacy effect on the trees into the future. And we'll also talk about that a little bit more here today. Unfortunately, tree planting budgets haven't even moved. And so they're kind of consistent with the past. So the lesson we learned here is there's no new money. And the money being allocated to things that perhaps are less desirable, such as removal of trees, compared to things that are more reliable or important, perhaps as maintaining the tree population you have or replacing things that are lost. Now, what was the overall financial impact, because this certainly affects budgets, is about $1.50. And so this is $1.50 per person, so $1.50 per capita. And so if you extrapolate this into the entire northeastern United States when we did the work, that's about $250 million a year being used for emerald ash borer, unfortunately not being used for other things. So maybe, parks in a community or trees. Now let's think about pruning. Is it really even needed? So you're a decision maker and you've got all this money you're spending on other things such as emerald ash borer work, and so you can ask the question, is it really even needed? And the answer is yeah, and you'll see this with some of the work Randy Krouse will talk about of things such as pruning trees at a young age, how much of an impact that can make. It's like a child. You show the right and the wrong to a young individual. When they become a teenager, hopefully they don't become a delinquent tree and they have bad, poor branch forming, and later on in life they become one of these trees that fall apart during a storm. Now we could say the ice storm causes damage, or you could say perhaps early in the life of the tree, the structural pruning had a huge relationship of allowing included bark to occur in this hackberry, which then fostered decay in this union of branches, which then fell apart during an ice storm, during a loading event. Now, we do have a couple papers. One in mind I can present to you is some work done by Dr. Greg Moore from Australia and his student. They found it was about 15 times less costly to structurally prune. So think again about budgets and all the impacts we have, things like emerald ash borer, and the importance of not forgetting something as important as structural pruning, and how you can pay dividends from a huge perspective. Your return on investment is just great with doing work on trees when they're young. Now, we also know trees that as they get older, things do happen. Branches die, branches break, you get decay, and certainly you may have some legacy effects of bark inclusion that maybe you just inherited or weren't able to get to a tree and a problem occurred. All these things make trees more susceptible to storms. And that was some work that we've discovered with trees and ice storms that I've been involved with, and also some more recent work I'm getting involved with on trees and wind. For example, hurricanes, or maybe in the Midwest where we get some of these wicked downbursts, these microbursts that I grew up with that can have a huge impact on storm damage to trees. Now this relates to another part of a municipal program, storm damage planning. And now it's kind of nice, about 55% of the people live in a place that says they have some sort of storm damage plan. Now this could be something about how do we deal with brush when it's on the ground, but I think more importantly you should be encapsulating in these plans on what to do with the urban forest before storms hit. So mitigate and make things preventable rather than picking up the brush on the ground, which is really predictable because we do know some work from, for example, Gary Johnson, University of Minnesota, discovered that about 85% of storm damage can be related to pre-existing defects. So let that sink in there for a second. Now, how does all this stuff even relate to other things going on in urban forest management, in tree longevity, ecosystem services? I want to share just briefly some work that I had the pleasure to do with David Sivier on actually looking at the effects of Dutch elm disease on ecosystem services that also relate again to the tree pruning aspect that I talked about. And so one thing we discovered that, let's take stormwater. Certainly stormwater is a very, very important aspect of municipalities. Major locations have to regulate for it for good reasons because I like, clean bodies of water as much as the next person. So you take Dutch elm disease. Trees can die unless you use some best practices. And Milwaukee, unfortunately, didn't have the best management practices that were developed in the 1970s. Before that happened, they lost most all their elms. But we played this game, what if? What if they could apply the science of the day of the 70s, going back to when Dutch elm disease was first discovered? And what we found, you can look at stormwater. And in actually doing the best management practices, which is active sanitation, looking at diseased trees, removing them promptly before you're reducing basically the spread of the disease to healthy elms. And what we discovered also was if you look at one ecosystem service, again here, stormwater, and you look at the price tag here, the amount of money that was being saved from the tree camp population, the canopy, on stormwater alone was the same price tag as it cost for the best sanitation program. So thinking of a problem, it's going to cost you money. And you can get rid of the problem, get rid of all the elms, but there's that environmental aspect you have to think about. And all things considered, the stormwater alone paid for that. Now, you've been really good listeners. I'll throw in for no additional cost a thing called air pollution. And just the removal effect of there, this was about 5 times, 6 times more in value than just the stormwater. So you're not only getting stormwater, that's paying for the program, you get these other savings that are really important for certainly society as a whole. And I'll even throw in here today energy savings, you know, the amount of money people are saving from air conditioning in the summertime, and CO2. So uptake of CO2 in trees. So all these things together are certainly big money makers. And you're doing some work to save money in the long term, but also not to have to spend a lot of money up front. And so if you could think about this from one other aspect, is if you're spending less money because you're investing some money on Dutch elm disease management, you're also retaining resources to provide pruning of your tree population. So here's the interconnection of this again. Now, another thing that we found was if you could look at something like risk management, and this is certainly related to tree pruning. And so we did some work from this data set, and we asked the question, is there any relationship to risk management in a town and things they do? So it probably doesn't surprise you. If you have professionals that are some sort of credential, like we could use ISA certified arborists, for example, or if they have a strategic plan or an updated inventory, or they have information about risky trees, is they're more likely to have tree risk management program. That doesn't surprise me. But we also found this cool thing, pass claim. So we discovered that you have about a 2 times greater odds to actually have a tree risk management program if you had a pass claim. So being proactive, pruning tree populations, reducing aspects of perhaps risk management, but overall protecting people through a thing like this is very important. Now, tree pruning is really important. It's a complex topic. We've got standards here, and the standards like A300. It's really gratifying to see these things are being used and actually encapsulated into programs that at a very high level. And we could also think of these standards. Maybe you've seen the tree standards. And if you're contracting out work, just don't say do work according to these standards. You know, dig a little deeper on what work do you want to have. The best management practices get into this in greater detail. But even more importantly, think about the objectives. And that's probably one of the big changes the more recent A300 version actually came about, was thinking about what is your pruning objective. Quite often clearance. So this first one on the list here, tree clearance for maybe automobiles, is an important aspect. But even more importantly, pruning to have an objective to spec out risk mitigation, so dead branches, branches with bark inclusion, for example, structurally developing young tree populations like you'll hear from Randy. And then things such as the pruning systems. For example, natural is the typical pruning operation. There's other things like espalier. Boy, I can't think of a time where I've seen a espalier pruning system actually along a street tree. Not that you couldn't have one, I've just never seen one. Typically the way you prune trees, we try to make some sort of natural form as our guiding principle, and we throw things on, how can we form in the natural form, and then think about things like clearance, but tree health and tree risk, for example. Now, we can look at crew productivity and efficiency, because money is important. How do you get the work done? How do you do it most efficiently? Now, economists would say spend the money most wisely. Now, when we ask the communities, how are you for budget? Almost half said, you know what, our budget is not at the level to meet our, our specified workloads. And unfortunately, they're at a level about 45% below what their anticipated needs were. Now, how does this stuff get allocated and, pied around? A little over half was allocated for city staff, about 41% for contracting, and about 5% of work was done by volunteers. Okay, so let's talk about these concepts and then wrap her up for a day. Now, let's look at something like tree removal or stump removal. What was interesting, people were telling us on a per tree basis, it was more expensive on a contracting level than a city staff level. Now, I'm not saying contracting is more expensive. It says it so in this data. Maybe the municipality data they shared with me didn't encapsulate everything, okay, such as maybe the cost of equipment or maybe pension budgets. I can tell you some of the communities I've worked with actually I'm comfortable that this data may be the way it is, but maybe the contractors are getting bigger trees. They're going to cost more. Interesting, if you look at across the time back to Kilboss, when you start collecting this data, and then our work, it's on a lot of operations such as tree planting, stump removal, pest care. These things all are kind of consistent from that in-house is at the same level, if not less expensive than at the contracting level. Again, I can't make the statement that municipal operations are less expensive. I'm just making the point that this is something that needs to be looked into, and the data actually suggests that may be the case. But the interesting thing is if you look at contracting can become really common. Where it used to be around 20% of the budget, was spent on contracting operations. Now it's about 40%. So I think this is an important question to actually solve. Is in-house cheaper than contracting? I would suspect maybe the answer lies somewhat in between. And so from an efficiency standpoint, I think this is an important research question. Just wanted to bring up. Now, home stretch here, thinking about volunteers. I can remember when I first got into this field as a student, and Bob Miller, one of my mentors, says, you know, there's this big organization, the Tree People in LA, and they're full of volunteers. And I'm thinking, why did I go to school if volunteers are going to do all the work? Don't worry about it. We actually found from this work that actually volunteers don't cost jobs. They actually create jobs because you have to have someone that actually helps leverage how people do work. And most volunteers will not show up for 280 hours, so a full-time employee equivalent. They're less time. They're about 1 day a week, or 1 day a year is all they spend. But what we did find is actually volunteers added to the program. They made programs more sustainable, which is kind of neat. So including volunteers maybe in structural pruning is an important concept. So I want to thank you actually for your time. I'm going to turn it over to our next set of folks here. And my pleasure to cooperate here with the Forest Service here today. So thank you very much.